Hello, my name is Josh Wurtzel. I am the chair of the American Psychiatric Association's Committee on Climate Change and Mental Health, and I also co-chair the new committee through the Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry on climate change. It's my pleasure to talk with you today briefly about some aspects of how climate change impacts mental health in this talk called Solastalgia and Climate Distress. My thanks to those who have helped make these slides and have reviewed them. A few learning objectives for today. First, we're going to describe how extreme weather events impact mental health outcomes. We'll then understand the concepts of solastalgia and climate distress and how they may contribute negatively to well-being and mental health. Third, we'll describe how subacute climate events can impact mental health. Third, we'll list some populations of patients and non-patients who are most vulnerable to the adverse mental health effects of climate distress and more broadly climate change. And then finally, we'll identify and provide some resources for patients struggling with climate-related mental health issues. So with that, let's get started. So climate change, when we think about it from the psychological perspective, can lead to impacts through three main channels. This is a diagram that was created by Clayton and colleagues. And you can see here that when there's a geophysical change associated with climate change, we can have acute events. So think about like an extreme weather event, such as a hurricane that affects a community. We can have chronic changes that come on more slowly, or they can also be kind of a series of acute changes. This might be, for example, heat waves that repeatedly hit an area, droughts, decreased air quality. And then there's also the social representation of that risk that people see when they're looking at their phones and on social media that leads to downstream consequences. When we look at this first bucket of effects, the acute effects, there have been data, there have been studies that show data with increased PTSD, depression, and anxiety in these individuals. And this can happen both directly from the event and also through kind of this exacerbation of other social determinants of health, things like job loss, migration, food insecurity. We see similar pathways for those who experience chronic changes, but then also there's been some evidence that we see increased risks of suicide, aggression, and psychiatric hospitalizations and other comorbidities. For this social representation of the risk, a lot of people are feeling, even if they're not actively experiencing these climate disasters themselves, the looming threat that they will, or also just the underlying angst that they're seeing the world deteriorate around them. And so this leads to an entity called climate anxiety, or what I more broadly term climate distress. So that leads us to some definitions. Solastalgia is a term that you might notice takes a root with nostalgia. It's a sense of a loss or a homesickness that we feel while we're still at home. And this is secondary to changes in a person's landscape around where they live due to climate change. Examples of this might be due to destruction of one's environments from wildfires, coastal erosion, rising sea levels. You get the idea. Eco-anxiety was the term that was first defined for this entity of kind of existential distress. It was defined as a chronic fear of environmental doom or worry about the future for oneself, children, and later generations due to watching the slow and seemingly irrevocable impacts of climate change unfolding. Later, we have broadened this term to climate distress, and that's to hopefully capture the wider range of emotions that what a person can feel, including fear, anger, guilt, and feelings of powerlessness and exhaustion in the face of climate change. There have been some studies of climate distress. The largest to date is completed by Hickman and her colleagues across 10 countries where they surveyed 10,000 young people ages 16 to 25 in 2021. They found that, and these are data from that paper, 84% of respondents reported at least being moderately worried about climate change, and 59% said that they were very to extremely worried about climate change. When they asked these individuals about how they felt these worries affected their daily life and functioning, 45% said that they felt like it negatively impacted their daily life and functioning. And interestingly, if you broke this down by different sociodemographics, the countries with fewer resources materially had even higher rates of reporting this effect on their daily life, anywhere from 50 to 75% of respondents. So we imagine then that there are a number of groups that can be more vulnerable to the impacts of climate distress on their mental health, and then even more broadly, some other impacts of climate change, which may be covered in other lectures, but I'll just briefly say are direct biological effects and indirect biological effects. We think of the increased temperatures from climate change directly impacting how our brains function, and our neurotransmitters in our brain. And then indirect effects come from things like airborne pollutants, increased range of where different bugs carrying different diseases that affect the brain and mental illness, even nutritional content of food and how that affects mental health. So when we think about these different groups of vulnerable people, we can think of those who have fewer resources to overcome the challenges of climate change, those who have lower income, who are homeless, immigrants, outdoor workers. All of these individuals are in environments where they are more vulnerable to natural disasters and have fewer resources to recover from them. They also may live in environments where they don't have climate control. There are different age demographics that are also more vulnerable. So, for example, elderly individuals, due to their physiology, are more vulnerable. Children also physiologically have more difficulties regulating their temperature when they're undergoing heat stress. Um, we also see that with peripartum women, and there are a number of other um, physiological changes that may make them more vulnerable, and then sociodemographic ones as well. Those with severe mental illness, we know, have difficulties regulating their temperatures at baseline, and this is further exacerbated during heat waves and warmer times of the year. And then there are also communities that have other social determinants of health that are exacerbated by climate change. So, for example, indigenous populations and people of color, there's some interesting literature looking at how those communities are more distressed about climate change, more interested in talking about it, and this may have to do with their different relationship, perhaps culturally, with the environment. Just delving in a little bit to a couple of examples of how these different groups are more vulnerable. For example, those with severe mental illness. I mentioned that they have disrupted heat regulation at baseline. Those who are on psychotropic medications, things like antipsychotics, antihistamines, anticholinergics, that can further impact a person's ability to cool during heat stress. We know that those with mental illness often are impoverished and therefore don't have the means to overcome a natural disaster or perhaps be in a climate controlled setting during a heat wave. They have many co-occurring conditions that can further exacerbate their vulnerabilities. So things like cardiovascular and pulmonary disease. And then they're dependent upon disruptible services. You can imagine like ACT teams or not being able to get to their clinics to be able to get the medicines they need. Children are vulnerable. We know this is true, as I mentioned, about their physiology, but there also are the disproportionate impacts of adverse childhood experiences on their psychological well-being. So the traumas that they face may have deeper imprints on their overall long-term mental health than it might to an adult. Um, they're also a dependent population on parents, and they often feel the betrayal of parents, the government, adults in general, not doing more to prevent climate change. And then indigenous populations, I had alluded to how they sometimes different cultures will have different relationships with nature. There was an interesting study that looked at Inuit populations in Canada, and when they've been impacted by climate disasters or also have become more aware of what climate change is doing to their natural world, there's been a higher incidence of alcohol and drug use in association with this, amplified prior traumas that they've had from all the injustices that have been done to their communities, and then also increased potential for suicidal ideation. There are a number of ways that we can try to support individuals who have climate distress. We need to engage with our patients and the general population at large psychologically. This involves trying to reduce psychological distance. Oftentimes, adults in particular will try to tell children that it's not such a big deal or that they're worrying too much, that they're many children are feeling like they're being gaslit by adults. So we need to make sure we're acknowledging their feelings and also support connections around others who may be feeling similarly. We need to promote social norms and group experience. So there are a number of ways that you can try to engage people in community settings or even in more formal group therapy sessions with others who are thinking about their climate distress. We need to try to mitigate loss aversion. So there's a lot of things that obviously we're going to lose in the face of climate change. And we need to try to identify perhaps potential gains or ways in which we can step up to the plate. This also is kind of couched in this idea of meaning focused coping, which is how do you take purpose in the face of crisis? This is work that came out of Viktor Frankl during the Holocaust and also acceptance and commitment therapy. These can all be utilized to help with this process. There's also the importance of reducing feelings of powerlessness and getting people actively engaged in climate action. This is called action-focused coping, and it's particularly powerful when it's done in a community of people who are focusing on their climate action. In a larger sense, keeping community in context, we need to consider developing community level plans with patients for extreme climate events. This is being done obviously in an academic circles across the country, but even on the political level, the Community Mental Wellness and Resilience Act is being deliberated by Congress and the Senate currently to try to create funds for community level plans for this resilience. We need to make sure that vulnerable patients are getting the external needs met. For example, access to cooling centers, air conditioning. There are a number of other ways that individuals who don't otherwise have the means need to be supported during these climate crises. In terms of just overall insights that have coalesced from the literature, there are three. One, we want to make sure that we're pairing information about risk with solutions and hope, right? We can easily get into what you might do on your phone, which is doom scrolling, and feel like there's no hope. But we need to make sure that we're holding the dialectic that, for example, while Earth may be threatening us with horrific storms, there also is so much healing that comes from being in green space, and that comes from preserving it. Two, we need to make sure that we're knowing our audience when we're talking about climate distress and these effects of climate change on mental health at large. Oftentimes, children, for example, won't know all the things that adults are doing or might not know exactly how climate change works. And so helping to assess their baseline knowledge and then providing information on an age appropriate or knowledge appropriate level. Also understanding people's temperaments and the psychological defenses they may be employing in the face of climate change is important so that we're not perhaps hitting our heads against a wall that otherwise is going to even lead to more resistance. And then finally, third, we want to make sure we're fostering collective coping. I'd alluded to this. We know that collective action, collective coping is so much more potent than doing individual action. I'm just going to list these here for you to look at. These are resources for individuals, for their own mental health, communities, and even mental health providers if you're interested in learning more about this topic. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope that you have been inspired to continue to learn about this topic because it's unfortunately likely going to be something that becomes only that much more relevant as the century progresses.